Hello everyone. I apologize for taking so long to get this video out. I started making it using the old Blender and I recently decided to just ditch that video and update everything since it seems most people might be using Blender 2.8 or newer by now. If you need help with older versions of Blender, please let me know. Also, I'm working on a Mac for this tutorial, but things should be mostly the same. So this video will show how to prepare a mesh object in Blender for texturing so that you can just upload the mesh into Second Life and apply the textures you make either in Photoshop or Gimp or directly in Blender. So once again, this video is intended for users of the online virtual world of Second Life, although the techniques are basic and can probably be used in most situations. Please note that this will not include how to set up any advanced lighting or materials for photorealism. This is simply going to cover a very basic way to unwrap your mesh and apply a texture to it for use in Second Life. Also note that I will be using Cycles render for this because I am using Blender 2.91.2, which uses Eevee and Cycles. If requested, I will make a separate video on how to do the same process using the more simple Blender render for those of you using Blender 2.79 and older. Since we are working in Cycles for this tutorial, I will be introducing some basic node editing. If you have never used nodes, don't be scared. I used to avoid them like the plague before I realized it is important to have at least a basic understanding of how they work, because I think this is what most creators are using for Second Life, and it is the first step to do some really nice, more photorealistic texturing. One last thing is that I will be trying to note hotkeys for Mac in addition to the PC as I go. I don't think there are a lot of Mac users out there, maybe they are, but most people are on a PC. Let me know if you have any questions about that. So let's get into the tutorial. First, start by revisiting some of the basic ways to select and edit parts of your mesh. In order to begin the process of unwrapping your object, which is something I will explain in a minute, you need to have a good handle over the selection tools and how to navigate around your mesh object. If you are new to Blender and don't know how to do this, I will link a video in the description to my tutorial on Blender interface and navigation. For these tutorials, I want to try and keep things as closely resembling prim editing tools in Second Life as possible. This is still a work in progress as I figure out ways to do that. But for now, let's take a peek into SL and have a visual of what I'm going to explain here. So here in World, I'm just going to res a basic cube, and I'm going to, since I already have the build tool open, it's here, but if you didn't, you would just right click on the prim and go to edit. So I'm going to look at the top here with these options. You see move, rotate, stretch. I want to select face, select the select face option, which will allow me to, if you can see here, this prim is closer now. Just when I left click, I can select any face of the cube. Whoops. So left click will select a face of the cube. So, and of course, you know, whenever you select a face of the cube, you can put color or texture. Those are some basic SL building things. So anyway, keeping this in mind, before I move back to Blender, so say I select one face, if I hold shift I can select multiple faces at once. So holding shift and left clicking allows me to select multiple faces. Just keep that in mind because this also works the same way in Blender. So let's go back to Blender, and you can also change the hotkeys in Blender to work the way that you want them to work, the mouse clicks and the hotkeys on your keyboard. Or you can do things the way that I like to do them. That is your own preference. Let me just show you where you can change hotkeys and how you use your mouse and keyboard in Blender. If you go to the top of your screen, go to Edit, Preferences, and go to Key Map, which mine is already open to. You can see that the first preference is Select with Mouse button, and you can choose either left or right click to enable you to be able to select something in Blender on your mesh. So I'm going to leave it on left because that feels most familiar to SL for me. But you can change whatever you want in this whole menu in terms of how your mouse and keyboard work to navigate Blender. So now that we're back in Blender, I'm going to just go over some of the basic ways to select part of your mesh, and I am going to zoom in a bit here, which is just Control and mouse wheel, or on a Mac mouse, just using your finger to go up to zoom in, and I'm just using a basic cube to start off with because it's easy. So I'm going to hit the Tab key to toggle into edit mode, because before we were in object mode by default. When you open Blender, you will always be in object mode. So Tab key will toggle between edit and object mode. So I want to be in edit mode, which shows you that my mesh is already selected. But what I can do is hit double A, so that was AA on my keyboard to deselect, and then at the top of the screen, now I went over these basics in my older Blender tutorial on interface and navigation. So you have these 3 select modes to work with your mesh, and the first is the vertex select, which means that you can left click on any of the vertices or vertex points and select them. The next one is edge select, which is self-explanatory. It allows you to left click on any edge and select it. And then back up here at the top left is face select, which will allow you to left click on the cube and click any of the faces individually. If you want to, just like we saw in SL a minute ago, you can hold shift and left click to select multiple faces. So you can either do single or hold shift, left click to select multiple faces around your mesh, however far you want to go with that. So that's just a basic review on that. Also, let me hit double A, because AA is to deselect, A is to select all mesh, and AA is to deselect all mesh. So that was also talked about in my last Blender video on interface and navigation, though I don't know if I did an update on some of the hotkey changes that came along with Blender 2.8. I will put out a new video that does kind of the basics of Blender all over again for some of the changes that they implemented in the newer version. So let's say that this is another way you can select parts of your mesh, is let's say I have a loop cut in my mesh, which is Control R or Command R on a Mac. You see the blue ring around the mesh. I can move this to any side I want, and when I have it where I want it, I will just left click to confirm. So left click to confirm twice. So 2 left clicks to confirm that I want the loop to be there. Now I'm going to double A to just deselect all the mesh, and as you can see at the top left here, I am in edge select mode, and so that's what we want to be in order to work with edge loops. So my goal here is to select this entire edge loop that goes all the way around the mesh in the center. This is also considered a subdivision of the cube. So in order to do that, I could technically just make sure I'm in face select mode here at the top, click an edge, left click an edge, hold shift, left click another edge, hold shift, left click another, and that would be a way to get multiple edges selected. But a faster way to do this, double A to deselect, is to hover my mouse over the center, over the loop cut, and hold Option while I hover my cursor and then left click. So Option plus left click will select the entire edge loop, and that's Alt key on I don't know if I said it, Alt key on a PC and Option key on a Mac. So Alt/Option key plus a left click right over the loop cut will select the whole loop cut all the way around in one click. So that's just another tip of a way that you can select mesh if you have like subdivisions and more of a complex shape. Okay, so, and obviously you could do this with face select mode as well. So if you go up here to the top, switch over to face select mode, and you could either select faces holding shift together as we saw, or you could hold the Alt/Option key over the row of faces you want to select all together and hit left click. Actually, when you do hold the Alt/Option key, make sure you hover over one of the edges in the row of faces you want to select. So let me do that again. Deselect. Holding Alt/Option, I'm going to, actually you don't need to hover over the edge. You can just click on a face in this row of faces. Sorry about that. So anyway, that is a quick way to get a whole row or loop of faces or edges selected on your mesh quickly. Now that we have reviewed the basics of selecting your mesh, let's begin with learning how to create a UV map by unwrapping your object. In basic terms, a UV map is just a flat 2D image of your 3D object, and it tells where and how your texture will appear on your object. So, using this cube as an example, we essentially need to tell Blender how to rip the seams of the cube open and flatten out the faces onto a surface, or the UV map image, which is where you will put your texture, and that will become your final image that you can upload to Second Life and put on your mesh. There are probably tons of ways to get through the UV unwrapping and texturing process, but this is just my simple way, what I've been doing for years, and I'm no expert. I started off not knowing anything, so this is just sort of self-taught. Before we start with unwrapping, let's first explain in simple terms what unwrapping your mesh means. Think of a cardboard box sitting in front of you in real life. If you wanted to flatten that box to use the cardboard for a project or something, or maybe to just store it somewhere flat, you would need to rip or cut the edges of the box and lay it out flat. That is essentially what Blender is doing to your mesh object when you unwrap it into a UV map. So the first thing we need to do is open the UV editor so we can see what we are doing. In Blender 2.8 Plus, there are some tabs at the top of the screen here, and one of them is called UV Editor, or UV Editing. When you click on that, you can see that half the screen is already the UV Editor. You can work with this if you want, but I like to create my own layout. So this is just how I like to do mine. You can arrange things on your screen however you like. So what I do is on the right side of the screen here, I can pull this out a bit. If you hover your mouse cursor over the borders of the sections, you can adjust sizes if you want. I'm going to hover over the top right corner of this bottom section here, and I see a plus sign now as my cursor. When you see that, you can pull out a new section of the window, either to the top, bottom, left, or right. So I'm going to pull down to pull out another section. So here in this middle section now I have my properties, which we'll be working with later, and then at the bottom I want to turn this bottom section into the UV editor. So in order to do that, left click on this little hamburger icon, and then from the menu choose UV editor, and now I have the same thing that we saw on the other side of the screen. So now that I have that, I can zoom into the space, the grid, the UV grid, with holding Control, and on a PC it would be a middle mouse wheel, I believe, and then on a Mac it's just Control and then moving your finger up on the mouse. So this is how I like to work, and as you can see, the empty grid area doesn't have anything on it, but this is where our UV map will appear once we unwrap our mesh object over here. So if you select your cube, which I will do, first I need to toggle into edit mode, and you do that again by hitting the tab key. Tab key toggles edit mode and object mode, so I'm in edit mode now. If you look over back to the UV editor side of the screen, you can see that there are already some shapes for our UVs. So the new versions of Blender, I hear it's something newer, as of like Blender 2.8 will automatically unwrap your object, and you can choose to stick with that or to redo the unwrapping your own way. And that's actually what I'm going to show you how to do. But anyway, so you could leave it this way if you want, but let's just take a look at how to do the whole unwrapping process ourselves and on a custom shape, because this is just a basic cube, so it's pretty straightforward, you know, where the faces are, and I'll go over this in a bit. So let's go up to the top of our screen, make sure we're in face select mode, which I already did. Up here, the three buttons is the one on the right, face select. Click that to make sure that we can select faces on our mesh. Then we are going to select the top face of the cube with a left click. And you'll notice if you work with Blender the way I have it set up to do left click for select, that's the same way that you would select a face on a prim in Second Life. So now that we have the top face selected, we are going to hit E for extrude and pull upwards. And if it was for some reason not going up, you could hold Z to pull it up along the Z axis, which is up and down, the blue up and down axis. So now that we have that, let's do E again to extrude one more time, and I could hit Z. For some reason it's already constraining it to the Z axis, but you can see that if you didn't have Z selected, it would just pull it up on any direction, but you want to keep it, well, in my case I want to keep it on the Z axis, so I would just hit Z to constrain the movement to the Z axis. So now that I have that, I want to just left click to confirm the action, the extrusion, and now as you can see I have some more faces to work with here on the cube. So with this top face still selected, which would have been a right click to select it, I'm going to hit S for scale or stretch, and I'm going to make it bigger, make the face bigger by I hit S and then I just pulled my mouse outwards, so then it stretched this top face in all directions. So that is how you could get something bigger on your mesh object. You could also, I mean, it would be essentially your project. I could pull the faces in like that if I wanted to, but I'm just going to pull them out like that. I'm not really making any particular object or shape, just trying to get something a bit more complex than the basic cube. So now that we have a bit more of a complex shape, let's see how we can mark the seams in order to unwrap this without the help of Blender. In other words, just doing our own unwrapping. So the first way that I approach this, I'm going to hit AA to deselect everything, is to mark seams. That's what I'm introducing now in the unwrapping process, is marking seams. So marking seams tells Blender where to cut open this object so that we can unwrap it into a flat image, if you refer back to the cardboard box example. The concept here, again, is if this object were a cardboard box in real life, where would you cut with the scissors in order to lay the box out flat? So in order to mark these seams around this object, you go to the top of your screen and go to Edge Select, which is the middle button, so that we can select edges on the object. And then you want to select where you would like to make a cut when it is time to tell Blender to unwrap this shape here. So in order to mark a seam, just hover over whatever edges you want to essentially cut and left click on the edge, and in my case I want to go all the way down this whole side here of edges. So I left clicked to select my first edge. You can see it's highlighted in red, hopefully you can see that, and I want to hold shift and I want to select the second edge and then shift and select the third edge, so I have this whole edge of this shape selected. Now what I want to do is go to right click and choose mark seam, which is down here. Now you can see that if I deselect my mesh, it's hard, you can hardly see it through this yellow, and I'm sure there's a way to turn off the yellow selection lines, but you can see somewhat hopefully that it is glowing red underneath this yellow line here, because this edge is now marked with seams. So no cutting has actually happened yet. I mean, we haven't unwrapped this yet. You won't see anything change, but you will see those edges glowing in red as you marked the seams. If you for some reason wanted to unmark a seam to clear it, get rid of it, you would just left click on the edge you want to unmark and right click and click clear seam. And as you can see, it's now not glowing red or orange, it's back to normal. So again, to put that seam back in place, left click, right click, and then choose mark seam. So I'm just going to go around this shape, and I'm going to think about where would I cut with scissors if this were like a cardboard box in order to open it up so we can lay out flat. So I'm going to just do, and this part would always be up to you how you want to do it. There's no standard way for every shape where you should put seams. You kind of just have to feel it out what you want to do. So I'm going to right click and click mark seam now that I had those three edges selected. And let's see, what I usually do is I try to imagine the piece that I marked being cut open and how it would lay out. So I think let's just go with that. Well, actually I'm going to do the bottom because I know the bottom needs to be cut open. So I'm doing these three sides. I do like to leave pieces connected so that the whole shape can mostly be connected if possible when I go to lay out or to unwrap. So right click, click mark seam. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with that and see how it's doing. I'm going to double A to deselect all the mesh, and then now I'm going to, now that we have all the seams marked, I'm actually going to just go back into up here at the top into face select mode, and then I'm going to select all by hitting A, and now it's time to unwrap. So you would hit the letter U for unwrap. And actually my keys are not showing up, so sorry about that. Now you can see what buttons I am using here on the screen. Just make that a little bigger. Okay. Sorry about that. So that was just N for another like properties menu. You don't need to worry about that for this tutorial. So now as you can see, I have all my mesh faces selected around the whole object, and that was by hitting A. And then if you look over here to the right in the UV editor, I have an unwrapped mesh now. So it's really that simple. It's as simple as hitting U, and then when you have your own time, you can play with these other forms of unwrapping to see what result they give you. You might want to use something different than just the standard unwrap, which will just read the seams that you've marked. Some of these other options will do their own cutting and marking, so you'd get like a different result. But you can play with that. Maybe I'll do another video that's separate that plays with the different unwrapping options, but I usually just go with the basic if I marked my own seams. So, as you can see, the faces are all laid out over here in the UV grid. This is the layout we will bake shadows and lighting to, and it is also where we will apply our texture so that it shows up where and how we want it to over here on our mesh. So if you notice in the UV editor window, there is a toolbar at the top of the section with buttons for the same types of selection modes as in the 3D viewport over here, like how we have vertex select, edge select, face select over here in the UV editor menu at the top. You have the same thing. You have vertex selection, edge selection, face selection, and then you have this is islands, which is going to let you select whole pieces of the connected faces or UVs all at once. So if we had let's see, if we had face select mode selected, we could just choose faces. It works the same way, left click as it does over here in the 3D viewport. Works the same way. And then the edge, it's self-explanatory. With edge select mode, you could select different edges, which is not showing up very clearly with different colors. And then vertex, same thing. You could select the vertex points with vertex select mode. So hopefully that's pretty clear. So let's zoom into our map, and I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger for now so I can zoom in. So again, when you're working over in this UV editor space, you can use some of the same controls. I'm going to hit Control and zoom in with my mouse, middle mouse wheel, so that I can just bring this up a bit closer. As it is now, it is mostly okay, but there are edges that need to be straightened up so that our texture won't be too distorted when we apply it later on. This process of editing your UVs can be done any way you like. It is up to you how to fit the UV shapes on the image area, however works for you and your project. I will just show you how I would edit this one to make it look more neat. So, first let's notice that these faces on the UV map all correspond directly to the face, to its own face on the object in 3D viewport. We are looking at the same object here, just in two different dimensions. This dimension is 3D, this dimension is 2D. So, and whenever we're working with textures and images, we're working with 2D images. So, same concept there. You can see how they are connected by making sure you're in face select mode and noticing that whenever you, over here in the 3D viewport, whenever you left click to select a face on your mesh, it highlights that same face over here in the UV editor in green. So, but what you would notice is that this is not a perfect square or rectangle as it is over here on the object. So if we were to lay a texture over here as it is now, it would be a bit distorted. So let's go back over to the UV editor window, and well, let's first select all of our mesh by hitting A, and then go back to the UV editor window and work on the overall shape and position. And this is just the way I would do this. Your approach might be different once you get a handle on what you're doing here. So the first thing I'm going to do is activate the island select mode here by hovering over. It's the last button at the top of the UV editor window. Click it, and then I'm going to select the whole piece of UVs here, the whole shape, and I'm going to hit R for rotate, just as I would over in the 3D viewport to edit the mesh, and then I'm going to hit 90 degrees. I just hit 90, so again that was, let's do it again, that was R for rotate, and then immediately 90, enter would rotate it 90 degrees. Now when you rotate on, yours, just like with mesh or over here, you don't have to do exact angles like 90 or whatever. You just do what works for you. As you can see, it still needs some straightening up, but that gave me a better start there to rotate it. So now, I don't know if I pointed this out, but since I have the island selected, you might have seen me, I don't know if you saw me move it, but to move it, you would hit G for grab, just like you would over here to move your object. So G for grab, once you have the UV selected, you can move it around the space that way. And you can drag it outside of the box. Sometimes when I'm working on a big complex project, I will drag shapes out around the outside of the UV editor just temporarily while I get things organized on my UV map space. So that's that. Next I'm going to hit AA for deselect, and I'm going to, actually here in the UV editor, sorry, hit AA in the UV editor, because A and AA work the same in the UV editor as they do in the 3D viewport for selecting. So now that I did that, I'm going to go to the edge select button here at the top of the UV editor, and so that I can select these edges and straighten them up. So because of coloring, this might be hard for you to see on my screen, but I'm going to left click and and hold shift, left click holding shift, because I want to make multiple edge selections here, and I want to start selecting multiple edges. I'm starting with this very left, most left edge here on the piece of mesh. So you can't really see the color that these are selected with, but it's selected. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit on my keyboard S, X for x-axis. S was for scale, and X is to keep the alignment on the x-axis, and then 0, the number 0 on my keyboard. And then I can left click to confirm that action. And what that did was it aligned this left edge to a perfectly straight line on the X with an amount of 0. So, or at the point of them being all aligned at 0. So now that I have that straightened out, I want to hit G, because it is still a little in on the shape, to grab, and then I'm going to hit X and pull this out so I can move this edge out on the X axis, and just to get it out of the way so I keep things nice and neat here. So I would just continue to straighten the rest of my vertical edges this way, just by holding shift, left clicking on another row of edges. Do the same thing, hit S for scale, X for X to constrain it to the X axis, and 0, and then left click to confirm. And then I have another edge done, so I'm going to just continue on here with the rest of these edges. S for scale, X for x-axis, and 0 to align them, and left click to confirm. Again, S, X, 0, left click to confirm. Then this last one, holding shift, left clicking, got those selected. Now S, X, 0 to confirm. So I have all my vertical edges done. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the horizontal edges. So this one's all one, so I'm going to select it, left click to select it, and then hit S, Y instead of X, because we want to constrain these on the Y axis, 0. Left click to confirm. So these are all going to be going along, adhering to the Y axis. So left click, hold shift, left click. Now I have this whole top row selected. S, Y, 0. Left click to confirm. Don't worry if you see overlapping, just try to keep track of where you are. Because overlapping faces would cause a problem ultimately on your texturing. So left click to select this whole row, keeping my place, and then S, Y, 0. Same thing, select the edges for this third row, S, Y, 0, and S, Y, 0, and the bottom one, S, Y, 0. Left click to confirm. Now I see there's an area here. Let me see what I did. I'm going to go to vertex select and try to get this vertex selected. Hit G, and I'm going to pull it up to see what happened here. I'm going to hit G, select this one on the right, hit G. Whoops, I was hitting the wrong key. There. So let's see what else happened here. G, Y. Okay, there. So in the process of straightening these other rows, some of the faces got overlapped, and then I lost a place of some of these vertex points, and sometimes you just need to go in there, you can zoom in closer sometimes to fix little kinks like that. So now that's all good. I'm gonna re-straighten these horizontal edges though. So left click, shift, left click, and then SY0 to get those straight again. And then SY0 to get them straight. Whoops. And then same thing here, SY0. And then let me just re-straighten this edge here, which I think, does that work? No, I don't think it does. Anyway, okay, SX0 to get that one straight. So now you see you have a perfectly straightened out UV shape here, which means that if I were to lay texture over this, they would all be nice and neat. At this point, I would like to bring in a texture to place onto my mesh object here so that you can see how editing the UVs on the UV map can affect the way the texture will look on your mesh. So, to do that, let's first make sure we are working in cycles in Blender. In this version of Blender, I'm doing all the texturing in cycles. On the right side of your screen, go to Properties. So here, this middle section is the Properties with all these tabs. Go to the Render tab, which is the little camera icon. Click that. In the drop-down menu that says EV, you want to just choose Cycles. So I'm not going to get into the details of what the differences are between cycles and EV, but just know that for this whole tutorial, we're working in cycles, which I think is what most SL creators are using now when they are in Blender. Next, at the top center of your screen, find the third button in this third circle or sphere button called Look Dev or Material Preview. Click that so that we can see the texture that we put on when we upload it. Now, for a simple way to get a texture on the mesh, go to the Materials tab in the Properties. So back over here in the middle section, scroll down to the sphere that's called Material Properties. Click that and scroll down to where you see Base Color, which is right here. And then click the yellow dot right here and choose Image Texture from the menu. So that means that we're telling this material that we want to use an image texture that we upload to apply to the layer of mesh. So that's just what we're using in this material so far. So what you want to do is go to Open, and then I'm going to go to my desktop. So you would just go to wherever you have your texture stored that you want to use for this. I'm going to use a wood texture. Click Open Image. So now that we have, actually, there is some work that needs to be done on this. As you can see, the texture is on, but the way that we straightened out the UVs is just causing some distortion here in the top loop of faces on the mesh. So when you run into things like that, obviously you would stop, and the rest of it looks okay according to how I would want this to lay out, but you would stop at this point in your project and go and do some work on the UV map so that you could straighten out any kinks like that. So I think that it's because the shape of the UVs doesn't follow the shape, like the tapered in shape of the mesh faces. So the custom seam marking and unwrapping that I did is not working out for these sides of the faces of the object. So what we're going to do is I'll show you another quick way to unwrap things is just have all the mesh selected. So making sure it's all selected. And then making sure you're on face select. Yeah, so I have it all selected, go to U, and then instead of unwrap at the top, select Smart UV Project, and I'm just going to leave it as is on the default settings and click OK. And as you see, you go around the sides and there's no distortion at the top anymore. Now this would obviously, this is up to you if you would want these lines to be going straight up and down and everything looks uniform, or if you want a bit of distortion, if that would make more sense for your texture, if you want things to be more angled at the top. So you just have to choose what option works best for you. I'll stick with this for now because it keeps everything nice and straight, and as you can see over in the UV editor, if I go to islands, then I can choose these groupings, these groups of faces. You could still move things where you want them to be, or you can keep them together as it unwrapped things for you. So I probably would just shift and select these islands together, and then the top face and the bottom face, it wouldn't really matter to me that those are separate, so that's fine. And then, so really it's up to you, but this works better for me than doing it on my own. And also I hold shift and left click to select these islands. I can hit G and Y to move them up a bit on the Y axis. If I want some space here between, I like to keep some space usually between my islands, because when I'm texturing, if like in Photoshop I'm doing my own texturing, sometimes you can get overlapping textures when you're using different textures for different parts of one UV texture map. But anyway, that's for another video. So now that things look a bit neater, the way that I would like them, if you go to face select mode here, choose a face again, you can see that if I move it on my UV editor, it moves over here on the left side of the screen in the 3D viewport. That's just again to show you how these faces are one and the same with the 3D version of the object. So just keep this in mind when laying out your UV maps, as you will need to rotate, scale, and move your UVs according to how you want your texture to be displayed on the faces of your mesh in SL. So think about when you get the object uploaded to SL and you bring in this texture map that you will bake out, is everything laid out to take that texture the way you want it to be displayed. So this is just one way you can make sure things look the way you want. You can play with the options. There are different ways to unwrap. I probably will do a video at a later point that concentrates more on the different ways to unwrap. Yeah, so you could also, another thing you'll find is that you could leave out the texturing in Blender. You still would need to unwrap your object and do this part of it, but you could leave out any texturing in Photoshop or Gimp. You could do all the texturing in Photoshop or Gimp once you have your, like shadows and lighting or your ambient occlusion map baked. So that's what a lot of people do too, but we'll get into that later. So, I wanted to just mention other ways to select parts of your UVs here that are quicker than using the shift select and individual selections. So like, let's say I wanted to select this edge of vertices. I don't have to click each individual one holding shift. I could use hit B, I think it's for border box or border select, and then left click and drag a selection, just like you would do in SL if you were going to select parts of mesh or parts of prims. You could drag a selection out like that. Now this whole edge is selected, so I could hit SX0 to, I don't want to do that, but that's an example of getting those selected all together quickly. You could also hit, let's deselect here, C for circle select, and that would allow you to, like almost like a paintbrush, paint around the vertices that you want to select. So like I have this whole right edge of these two islands selected. So then if I hit SX0, whoops, you have to right click to get out of circle select. SX0, it would align those, but I don't want to do that. So that's just a few more ways to select. Another thing quickly, another way that might work for you for unwrapping that I just thought of is if I go back over here to the 3D viewport, and I have, this is my last face selected because I have it all selected, and then I just make sure I select this square face here, hit U, and follow active quads, which then I'll just choose even, I guess. And then as you can see, it went ahead and unwrapped all of the faces according to this square face as a guide. So sometimes, I mean, that doesn't work for me in this case because I still get the distortion at the top here, but if this were another project that you're working on, that might help too. I think it helps with some like curved or tube shapes, unwrapping those, because they're not by nature very straight, so you don't usually get like a perfect unwrapping using the basic ways with more curved objects. But that's just an example of another option you can use in the unwrap. I'm going to hit Control Z or Command Z to go back and undo that because I want to keep this option for my UV layout. So now that I have that, there's just one last thing that I want to show quickly before we move on to the next part of the tutorial, is that if I just again make sure I have all my faces selected on my mesh with A, go over here to UV editor, I can put a new image texture by going Image, New, and selecting from the drop down menu Generated Type and choose either UV grid or color grid. I'll do color grid for this one, click OK. And if I, let's see, zoom out here of UV editor, I got confused there. You should be able to see if I go over here to, let's see, where would I change that? There, to untitled. So if I go back up in the properties, the material properties window, and go down to under base color, and where I had opened my wood texture, I would just go to the drop down here and select this untitled because I didn't name it, I just opened a new texture with the color grid, and then that would show me more of a direct connection between where things are on the UV map and where things are over here on the 3D mesh. So you could just like reference the quadrants or the sections and colors in case you get lost on your UV map, like, gee, where is this face? Where is this? Sometimes it's easy to get lost when you're trying to unwrap and texture your mesh. So that was a quick tip there, pretty basic though. Now that you have hopefully a basic understanding of the UV unwrapping and editing process, I want to make note that you don't necessarily have to mark seams on your mesh to unwrap faces. If we go over to the viewport here and just left click, actually go to edge select here at the top middle and select all of our mesh and right click and choose clear seams. We can then go back to face select mode at the top here and double A to deselect the mesh, then shift and left click on a few faces that we might want to unwrap together, and then we would hit U and unwrap. And as you can see over here, it went ahead and it unwrapped just the faces that we selected. And then if we go to the islands button here at the top, we could select this whole thing, go R for rotate, so R for rotate 90 to get it rotated exactly 90 degrees, and then S for scale to scale it down, and G for grab to move it where we want it. So I did, as you can see, I did that without even creating any seams to tell Blender where to cut. You could do things this way. I just don't know if that would work for your entire project. You just have to be careful of, what you're doing and what is the most efficient way for you to work through this process to get the result that you want. But that was just a quick little thing there. You can use all seams, you can use a combination of seams and no seams, or you can try to do this all without relying so heavily on seams, whatever works best for you. So that does it for this part of the tutorial for UV unwrapping and editing. I'll see you in part 2, where we will learn all basic ways to get texture onto your mesh. See you there.